I'll start this episode with a couple of quotes. The first quote is, "If you were allowed one wish for your child, seriously consider wishing him or her optimism." Daniel Kahneman. I've always thought that the right balance is somewhere between optimistic and delusional. Magnus Carlsen. The first quote is from my favorite book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Kahneman is talking more about optimism in general here, whereas in the second quote, Magnus is talking about optimism specifically during competition. I think that these two perspectives complement each other really well. Kahneman emphasizes the importance of optimism in life, whereas Carlsen shows how that same optimism, when applied to competition, can push us beyond our limits. In the online poker community, we often see the opposite. The space is filled with pessimism, scandals, cheating, and the ever-present talk about the supposed death of online poker. I first really noticed this when I started posting a lot about poker and starting my YouTube channel and things like that. I noticed that whenever I posted something really bad about online poker, like a sort of a crisis, that post would do so much better than the average post that I would make, and it would often go viral. And I would also not get criticized as much. It seemed like everybody would agree with me and everybody would applaud me for raising the alarm about whatever I'd posted. But for so many years, people have been predicting the end of online poker. Not just anyone. Extremely smart, accomplished poker players have said this. And yet, here we are, still playing and still thriving. And yes, I said thriving, and I really do mean that. It might not be obvious to outsiders, but there are still plenty of people making a great living playing online poker in 2024. The games have become tougher, for sure, but in many ways, this is one of the most exciting times to be a professional poker player, because we're in the midst of a renaissance in poker technology. The tools available today for studying and analyzing the game are far more advanced than what we had even 5 or 10 years ago. In my main coaching program, Mobius Cash, I work exclusively with high-stakes players, and each year I get to work with players who are consistently crushing online poker, and they earn a low to mid six-figure income doing so. These players often operate under the radar. You won't find them spewing negativity on poker forums. They're too focused on succeeding in a game that so many people have written off. But surprisingly, even a lot of them internally feel pessimistic about poker. And I've started to think about this more and more and realized that it's an understandable perspective to feel like online poker is just too good to last for very long. But I don't think it's a very helpful perspective. So this episode is going to be about shifting from a pessimistic perspective to an optimistic one. And I'm making this episode for anyone who is doing pretty well in poker right now. You're satisfied, if not doing great, but just doesn't really feel that way. Instead, you have this feeling of impending doom, and you don't know how to get rid of it. I'm not making this episode for people who are currently really struggling with poker, especially those who have been for a while and don't really know how they're going to fix that. A simple change in your mindset is probably not going to dramatically change your results, at least not immediately. So I don't want this to be misconstrued as wishful thinking or giving anyone any sort of false hope. Now, I have to admit, I'm a recovering pessimist. Despite achieving a lot of success in online poker over the past 5 or so years, first as a player and now as a coach, I've often feared that it could all disappear overnight. I've imagined waking up one day to find that maybe bots or RTA or rake increases or new regulations have made the game completely unbeatable and it leaves me without any sort of livelihood. And I would often dwell on these potential negative scenarios, and it would cause me immense anxiety and even bouts of depression. And I know I'm not alone in experiencing those feelings. But lately, I've been working on changing my outlook, And not only has my productivity improved a lot, I actually just enjoy my job a lot more now. And I enjoy life more when I'm not working. Winston Churchill once said, "For myself, I am an optimist. It does not seem to be much use being anything else." And I feel like I understand what he means now. First of all, pessimism achieves very little. You should really either stay in poker and enjoy it or get out. But to stay in poker with one foot out of the door is not a recipe for success. At best, it's going to stress you out and make you not fulfill your true potential as a poker player. I also think there are reasons to be optimistic. If you currently make a living playing online poker, or really any significant amount of money, you are extraordinarily lucky. You play a game on the internet for a living. Take a moment to think about how incredible that is. Even if it doesn't last forever, you can still be grateful that you got to do this for as long as you could. You don't have to answer to anyone. You don't have a boss. You don't have to ask to go on a vacation. You don't have to commute to work. You can plan your day however you want, pretty much. If you want to go for a walk at noon, you can do that. You have total freedom to live and travel where you want as long as you have an internet connection and access to an online poker site. So, absolutely nothing wrong with anyone who works like a quote normal job, but there are a lot of things about normal jobs that are not ideal that we don't have to deal with as poker players, and that is a gift. I think another reason to be optimistic is that online poker has been extremely resilient over the past couple of decades. There have been times where it looked like online poker was doomed, and yet it survived. And just think about what would have happened if you were, let's say, playing online poker for a living back in 2014, and you listened to someone who very convincingly said that online poker was dead and you should go find some other job. If you had followed that advice, you would have missed an entire decade where you could have kept doing this lucratively. I think the simple reality is that people just love poker. It's a truly great game, and people are going to keep playing it. And if it's at all possible to keep playing it online, people are going to do that because everything is moving virtual. Some people think that there's going to be a return to real life experiences. I don't really see it going that way, at least not in the short term, because from what I see, that the internet is just becoming more and more present in people's lives, and real life experiences are being replaced by virtual ones. And whether that's a good thing or a neutral thing or a terrible thing is out of the scope of this episode, but for sure, within the context of wanting online poker to survive, that's a very good thing. Another thing I think about a lot is how we really can't predict the future, especially now in the age of AI and just the way that technology is accelerating. It's harder than ever to see or sort of predict how things are going to go. And it's very possible that if you quit poker right now and you pivoted to another industry that you thought had a better outlook, by the time you get to that industry and train yourself, that industry could completely change. Personally, I would rather go with the flow and stick with poker because it's what I'm good at and it's what I enjoy. And maybe there will come a time in my professional life where I have to transition to a different phase, but I would rather just cross that bridge when I need to. Another thing that I've learned about myself is I often project out many years. So I'll think 5 to 10 years in the future, how am I going to continue playing poker? And the problem with that is that poker does get more difficult each year, and at least it usually does. And so if you think about poker getting more and more difficult every single year, and that you have to not just survive this year, but 5 or 10 or even more years than that, that can very quickly get overwhelming. Instead, I try to focus on what can I improve on this year? How can I stay ahead of the competition this year? And to actually make that part the fun of what I'm doing. Because it actually can be fun. I mean, think about it. If you just won every year without like having to put any effort into it, that might be an ideal situation financially, but it wouldn't be a very fulfilling situation to be in if you just never had to challenge yourself, if you never had to stretch and overcome obstacles. There's actually another Winston Churchill quote about optimism that I really like, which is, "The pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. The optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty." So instead, the way that I look at this is I love poker, and more specifically, I love strategy and technology, and I love teaching. And poker provides a high stakes arena for me to do all of that. And I'm going to be grateful to keep doing this for as long as I can. And if someday I decide that there's some better way that I could be spending my time, or if poker just truly isn't feasible anymore, then I trust that I can transition into something else. So let's shift from the sort of zoomed out general optimism perspective to the benefits that optimism brings to you while you are competing. So going back to that Magnus Carlsen quote about the right balance being somewhere between optimistic and delusional, he went on to say in that interview, which I'll post in the show notes, that if you're just slightly more optimistic, you're always going to see more opportunities. You're going to take more opportunities. You're going to take more risks and find ways to put more pressure on your opponent. And that ultimately is just a good thing. And that's almost self-evident, right? I mean, think about if all things were kept equal, who would you rather be playing against? Would you rather be playing against a bunch of pessimists, or would you rather be playing against those same people, but with an optimistic perspective? Players who assumed that they were going to beat you rather than assuming that you are going to beat them. A common thread that I have identified amongst students who can't win no matter how much I teach them, it's not so much an issue these days because now, like I said earlier, I pretty much only take on players who are already quite successful in poker. But in the past, I would notice that the common thread among those students who just can't win is that they don't want to win pots badly enough. It's like the moment that they see a card is bad for them, or they see some unexpected raise, they think, that's it, I've lost the hand, it's over. Winning in poker requires a sort of creative persistence. In other words, you have to be a bit unwilling to believe that you've lost the hand until it's proven to you that you've lost the hand based on the fact that you've exhausted every other option to win the pot. And you're confident that folding is just the best decision. Unsurprisingly, people who don't have this type of persistence at the poker table tend to believe that they are more unlucky than everyone else at the table. They have this defeatist mindset that almost guarantees failure in poker and also in many other areas of life. One piece of advice that I give to players all the time is to play the game fold, call, or raise whenever they're faced with a bet. So a lot of players will just think between the first two options. They'll think, I'm facing a bet, should I fold or call? But I always remind players to throw in the possibility of raising, because it usually pays to be more aggressive in poker. Typically, people don't play aggressively enough, and they play more passively than the GTO strategy would. And so there are going to be a lot of times where you're facing a bet and you're thinking about folding, but if you just considered raising, you might realize that, well, my opponent isn't actually repping anything. Like, I don't think that he actually has anything. Or you might see that your hand actually has great qualities to be turned into a bluff raise, like good blocker qualities. Or you might be sitting there with a value hand and just about ready to reflexively click call versus a bet. And you might realize that your opponent can very rarely have a hand stronger than yours, and that you could actually get more money out of this hand by raising for value than just calling. So always consider every possible action that you could make, even the ones that might, on the surface, seem ridiculous. Is it possible to be too optimistic? Of course it is. But most players, I think, have a tendency to err on the side of being too pessimistic as opposed to being too optimistic, at least most professional poker players. So to tie this all together, I'll leave you with a mindset that has served me really well. And that is that it is okay to sometimes be pessimistic in the short term, but you should always be optimistic in the long term. This will allow you to be prepared for any potential worst case scenarios while keeping the conviction that everything will work out in the end. That's all for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. It helps me out a lot. And I'll catch you on the next one. Good luck at the tables.